Good evening, listeners. I'm your host, Jerome, and welcome to the Afterlife Archives. This week, we'll be talking about the effects of biotechnology on our communication with the dead. To start us off, I'll give a quick explanation of what biotechnology is. Biotechnology, or biotech, is essentially using animals or their products to benefit humans. It ranges from genetically engineering immunities to diseases, to altering crops and their growth, to even creating new energy sources. Biotech can be seen in almost any setting. However, the most common can be found within our grocery stores. For a specific example, have you ever wondered why banana flavoring for things such as candies tastes nothing like the ones you can find in a grocery store? This is because in the 50s, the entire banana industry was hit with a strain of Panama disease that wiped out the industry in its entirety. Scientists were de facto forced to genetically manipulate the bananas to be resistant to this disease, and in doing so, they changed the flavor profile of mass-market bananas. The flavoring used in candies is entirely synthetic and is based on the strain of bananas that was hit with the disease, so the flavoring didn't change even though the flavor of bananas had to. With all things that bring advancement to humankind, there are always negatives. In the case of biotechnology, there are numerous ethical concerns as to the procuration of resources for tasks. We will be going over the case of George Best, a British man who passed in 2005. Mr. Best came into the hospital with simple flu-like symptoms and was subsequently treated for renal bleeding. It was related to why he originally came in. His condition at first improved, then deteriorated rapidly until he required a ventilator since the bleeding had transferred to his lungs. He then passed away on the 25th of November 2005. The reason I'm mentioning this is because Mr. Best was highly regarded as the peak of modern-day biotechnology. This was because even though it was morally questionable, Mr. Best was the first person in British history to receive a dead liver. Throughout his last days, there was a constant emotional trauma to his family, since every half hour it was a constant bounce around from being pronounced dead, almost dead, or alive. Soon after his passing, many people argued that it was unfair for Mr. Best to receive the initial transplant back in 2002, which was the cause of the problems that arose in 2005. Since he was an alcoholic and therefore unserving, many people argued that he was vampiric in nature due to the fact that he was living through someone else. He was also said to have lived as a technical cyborg in a sense, since most of his bodily functions in his last days were conducted by machinery such as ventilators and dialysis machines, rather than his own liver and lungs. George Best is a perfect example of how the term cyborg is simply vague, and with modern medicine and biotechnology, the line between fiction and reality is becoming increasingly more blurry. Things such as pacemakers, prosthetic limbs, and respirators cause the line to be more vague, due to the definition of cyborg being a conglomerate of organic living tissue and non-living machinery. Post-liver transplant, Best had interviewed with the Daily Mail, where he had spoken about what it was like in the operating room and the ICU. He told the Daily Mail that when he was put under anesthesia, he had dreamt that he had already passed, and when he awoke, he could not tell if it had passed or if it was simply a dream. The entire interview shows how receiving an organ transplant can be felt as if the recipient is living a vampiric existence, since they are living to the death of someone else. After his life was prolonged in 2002, he continued to live in the constant ping-ponging of home and the ICU with constant medical issues, to the point where he was labeled as the dead man walking. Respirators are a massive biotechnological advancement for medicine, for lung issues and at times where the lungs are simply not enough anymore. However, in the case of brain death, once a person's brain ceases to function, the heart and lungs would typically soon follow. With the advent of respirators, brain death is not simply death anymore. It is an entirely new concept that is deeply liminal and dancing on the line of ethics. Brain death can simply be used as a placeholder term for keeping a person not quite dead, yet not alive, solely for the purpose of organ harvesting for donation. On its own, it could be taken either way, for the good of someone else, or unethical, and the live and let die mentality. George Best's description of these machines to the Daily Mail highlights the ethical gray area where they reside. In his interview, he states that during the time he was on a respirator, he was in immense pain, unable to talk and or communicate due to him being weak to the point of immobility. These sort of issues are rarely ever discussed to go alongside with the hope of using them to keep someone on the constant verge of death. And now for an ad break with our sponsors. This week, we're sponsored by our merch store, notawebsite.com. And now for some cultural insight. In Nigeria, the general view on biotechnology is negative, since spiritually they view that even after death, the body remains significant and not to be tampered with. Therefore, in other cultures in Africa with similar spiritual beliefs as well as Nigeria, there's a clear lack of willingness for organ donation. In Western countries such as the UK and the US, there is a much more general acceptance of such concepts to the point where there are specific guidelines for the use of deceased in biotechnology while having a regard for ethics. In the United Kingdom and the States, there's a quasi-property status of dead bodies, which essentially allows them to be used in scientific research while falling in the realm of what is considered to be ethical. In Nigeria, there are less concrete and established paths to follow, leading to major ethical concerns with the use and commercialization of the dead and of organ harvesting. Modern biotechnology has in a sense blurred the line of how dead bodies are perceived, since more and more new ways that they come in handy for scientific research are discovered. There's a loss in the personal ability of the dead, and a greater scientific possessiveness towards them. This indirectly leads to the ethical concern of informed consent, where the relatives and friends of the deceased are not entirely clear on how their loved one's corpse is being used. To give an example of this, picture trying to tell a grieving family that you're going to carve open a gaping cavity to give the deceased's liver to someone, their kidney to another, and the heart to a third individual. While this overall leads to the saving of 3 separate lives, it is still a difficult discussion to have. Even with certain practices within biotechnology have raised questions of what is dead. With modern techniques of keeping the deceased, such as cryopreservation, it is hard to keep the same definition of what is dead. In Nigeria, the belief that it is impossible to manipulate the body after death without having a direct effect on the soul and/or spirit. Contrarily, in Western societies, the same concern is mediated through use of bioethics by making sure that the scientific advancements do not violate the dignity of the deceased. This week's second sponsor is Wikipedia. Use code AfterlifeArchives to get 10% off your Wikipedia Premium subscription. One of my personal favorite terms to describe current society is the phrase terminal capitalism. Biotechnology has improved to such lengths that there's a push to make harvesting and/or selling of organs legal, which on its own is a mind-bogglingly insane concept. It is not just the selling of one's own organs. The look ahead into the future of biotechnology is scary in a bioconsumerist sense. Things such as hormone-altering drugs to help you focus, synthetic muscles to make you the best at any physical activity, to even customizing your future child as if you were buying a car from a dealership, where you would be able to change everything from the hair color, eye color, to even the gender of the child, all for some ludicrous price. Through the constant forward movement of society, things that were taboo for generations prior are now significantly more commonplace. Things such as divorce, living with one's partner prior to marriage, and in vitro fertilization that were considered taboo not 70 years ago are so commonplace that it's almost a form of vetting to live with your partner before getting married, and the average divorce rate is now around 12 per 1,000 marriages in Canada. Looking ahead into the future of biotechnology and late-stage capitalism, it is easy to see that in the not-so-distant future, previously mentioned concepts like customizing your child would become so entirely commonplace in society and no one would give it a second thought. Nowadays, people are constantly getting plastic surgery to fix themselves to their own personal state of perfection. One cannot simply age with grace anymore. Plastic surgery used to solely be for the upper echelon of society and has steadily trickled down to the middle class. It is at the point where essentially children fresh out of high school are getting lip fillings, nose jobs, and such. It is to the point where something as slight as a birthmark is grounds for fixing to align with current societal sense of perfection. Things like antidepressants and other mind-altering pharmaceuticals are commercializing themselves for the wrong reasons. People that genuinely have chemical imbalances within their brain are benefiting from such medicine, but as someone who falls in the category of being clinically diagnosed with both depression and ADHD, seeing a recent influx of uncountable amounts of people self-diagnosing these conditions and expecting a miracle from these types of drugs is a strange sight. It is understandable, however unnecessary, for a widow to take antidepressants to help cope with the mourning of their recently deceased partner, or a person taking them to deal with life in a war-torn area of the world. Literal children who are simply not doing the best in school, or people stressed out from their jobs, taking them because they are marketed as a cure-all drug that is guaranteed to put a smile on your face and make your social life flourish is a hugely concerning sight to see, and it is assumed that they are not normal without these drugs. To bring this week's episode to a close, we talked about George Best and his recounts of his liver transplant, as well as the media portrayal of his passing, the opinions and regulations of several different cultures on biotechnology and how the way the dead are treated, finally this current societal state of biotechnology and how in the near future there will be a vast shift towards body augmentation. To leave you off this week, I would like to ask to see if you can figure out a new definition for the term cyborg that still keeps it in the fictional realm and not one that can be seen around you every day. Once again, thank you to our sponsors. Tune in next week where we discuss ancient Egyptian mortuary and funerary practices. This has been the Afterlife Archives with your host, Jerome. Have a spooky night.